Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, and I'm taking the newest bass guitar plugin by Neural DSP for a spin, and it's called Parallax. Compared to many other premium plugin vendors that I've covered on the channel, Neural DSP has enjoyed quite the spree of high recommendations from me. I think they've excelled at bringing high value plugin packages to people that include tones that you'd have to spend, 4, 5, maybe 10, 20 times as much to get the same sort of sounds, whether we're talking the Fortin collaborations, as well as the Plenty plugin for guitars, or even the Dark Glass plugin for bass guitars previously. And I don't necessarily think I'll be able to make those same kind of recommendations today based on those value descriptors, at least in the traditional sense, because Parallax isn't a copy. It's not a software version of a product that already exists. Parallax is really a utility. More specifically, this is a bass guitar mixing utility of sorts. And though you'll find the same sort of great features you'll see on other Neural plugins, such as a cabinet simulation and the same sort of minimalistic UI, it goes about its tone generation in such a fundamentally different way that it's hard to compare to a traditional bass amp or preamplifier pedal or overdrive pedal or what have you. So before diving into specifics, it's really crucial to talk about what this plugin is, what it does, and perhaps more importantly, what it is not. Because depending on your stance on that, it's really going to determine whether or not I recommend this to you specifically. You see, Parallax basically takes one of the oldest tricks in the book when it comes to heavy metal and hard rock bass guitar recording and puts it all in one nice, neat package for you. Of course, if you're recording a bass guitar, you can always plug it into an amp in a cabinet, mic it up the same way you would a full stack or half stack for a regular high gain heavy metal guitar. But the standard is really DI nowadays. And with all these great plugins and line level pedals like the Dark Glass stuff or the Sans amp stuff that came before it, there's really not much of a reason to drive a real speaker cabinet, because a lot of the low end, a lot of the articulation from a bass guitar is kind of already there. Personally speaking, I always think a cabinet IR is needed for bass guitars, which this does have, which is good. But manipulating the DI is really common within the industry, and this is what this does. So instead of having a amplifier section, or instead of like the Dark Glass plugins, which has a model of one of their pedals, this basically takes multiple bands and you do different things with them. So that trick I was telling you about is basically to split up the bass guitar signal into two ways. You have a low part and you have a high part. Now the low part you want to keep clean and extremely compressed. This helps retain a consistent low end to your mix that doesn't drown out the fundamental of the note, which can certainly happen if you put too much distortion. It can get flubby, it can be drowned out by other parts. So this really helps glue stuff like the kick drum to other parts of the mix. Now with the high side, that's where you might want to add a little bit of bite, a little bit of dirt, some distortion to help bring out those clangy treble frequencies, which is especially important in stuff like hard rock and heavy metal. And of course, you can make it completely clean if you like, and you'll get that 80s to 90s thrash metal bass sound, or you can throw on all sorts of dirt. But since you have a split signal, you don't have to muddy up the low end, and it still sounds like a bass guitar where it counts. And this is basically what this does. However, Parallax actually includes a middle band as well, which is a really nice inclusion because there's a lot of critical frequency content there. So it basically does, as I said, on the low end, there's a low pass filter that starts around 100 hertz, still keeps plenty of frequency content up to about 500 hertz there. And there is nothing going on here except for compression. You can kind of control your low pass as well, going all the way down to 70 hertz, all the way up to 400 hertz if you want to keep that much clean. You have an independent level control. Same thing with the high. You have a high level, high pass control, so you can move that up and down as well, extending up to 2000 hertz, which I think is far too trebly, all the way back to 100 hertz if you want more crossover with your low end. Instead of compression, though, you actually have a drive characteristics, which can, you know, add more dirt, go all the way up to like full-blown stacked overdrive kind of distortion. And then the mid distortion, all you have is level and mid drive. The band itself is actually fixed to 400 hertz range. For fine-tuned post-processing controls, you have a 6-band graphic EQ, which actually 2 of those are the low and high shelf, with anything from 250 to 1500 hertz, a lot of the critical frequencies. Personally, I like to see something in like the 28 to 3200 range as well. Certainly works and is a great inclusion. I use graphic EQs on basically everything, bass guitar included. And then, of course, as you might expect, there is a speaker simulation as well, which includes the same basic suite of microphones that you have come to expect with Neural DSP. There are a few weird things about this one. First things first, I don't know what speaker cabinet or even speaker model, for that matter, that they've captured with these impulse responses, but the artwork is weird. There's not an actual picture of the mic, which is fine. I don't really look at them to dial it in. I listen. But it's this abstract looking 3-dot thing, which I'm not exactly sure how this is supposed to tell you where the microphone is, other than just looking at the center dot, but whatever. They've also not included some of my favorite microphone sounds that were on the Dark Glass plugin, which is really unfortunate. You got the same sort of SM57, 906, 421 ribbon microphones, but my favorite microphone for bass is the Beta 52, and it's not here. Huge buzzkill. I'm not even kidding. That is one of my absolute favorite sounds, and it's not here. Also, no sub kick option, which was in the Dark Glass plugin as well. Don't really feel it's needed here since you have that low end compression control. Would have been nice to see. So a couple odd choices with the cab section, but certainly functional, and it does sound good once again. So I don't know if this is a 10-inch speaker, 15-inch speaker, could be 12-inch, who knows. Either way, it's quality, but it's missing my favorite mic, which is going to make me use other impulse responses if I'm going to use this seriously. Back at the top, you have your usual input level, gate control, oversampling control, output level, all that good stuff, but they really went hard on these presets, especially John Stockman. If he made all these artist presets, then damn, congratulations, I'm impressed. But there's a lot of good stuff to start with. I think this is definitely a plugin you will want to take advantage of some of the presets just to get an idea of what controls are doing, because this is something that's easy to make sound bad if you're not used to dialing in this kind of setup. With that said, I imagine many of you are going to be comfortable operating in this kind of workspace because practically every budget-oriented or free tutorial that I've seen, including my own, on how to get a recorded metal bass guitar sound basically does this. It splits it into 2 tracks instead, where you'll separate these controls, but nonetheless, it's the same idea. And that really is problem number 1 with this plugin for me, with value. Because if I wanted to do this, I already can do this same sort of sound with free plugins. Now, it's not as convenient, it's not as wrapped up in a nice tidy package, and quite frankly, some of it doesn't sound as good. But by the time you put it in a mix, some of those details really get lost, and I don't care anyway. So that's one thing you have to consider is, do I really want this kind of functionality? Is that worth it for me? Or would I rather just split a couple tracks and have more capability to do it that way? And while the convenience factor may not be there for a lot of those options, you'll find that those are actually a bit more versatile. You have a bit more control, which can be a double-edged sword for those of you that have, you know, that kind of phobia of option paralysis. But in my use case, I actually wanted a few more knobs here. I would have liked to be able to control the slope of those filters to get the crossover points a little bit more in line to how I like them. I wanted a mid control. Sometimes 400 hertz just wasn't working for me. When I was using this with extended range guitars in a mix, I kind of wanted to bump it up or down a couple hundred hertz just to see what would happen. This gives a very specific honky sound, which again is cool in one way because this gives the product its own identity, but in another way it is limiting. So if you're not happy with that particular control, then you're shit out of luck. My second biggest contention with this plugin is it really doesn't sound much like a bass amp, which is fine, it doesn't have to. But personally, if I'm going to go through the trouble of recording guitars through either real tube heads or VST plugin versions of them, I want my bass to sound like it's going through a huge stack of 8x10 speaker cabinets and 2x15s, whatever. And this really doesn't have the same vibe. It has the speaker part going, which is good. That is a must for me. But even stuff like the Dark Glass plugin or Dark Glass pedals, you put those things through a power amp and it really comes to life. It sounds like you're putting it through, an overdriven Ampeg or Mesa 400 Plus, something like that. And this just doesn't have that vibe. It's very much sounds like a manipulated DI, which again, if your mix works with that, then great. But I don't really care for the sound of a raw bass guitar sound for my mixes. I've never have. And this very much is like that. I don't know what the distortion character is either, but it's very hit or miss for me. If you keep most of the controls flat, don't really add too much bite to the high end, really compress the low end, you get, again, that really super smooth Tom Araya bass sound, which is super cool. And it does have a bit of an ampy quality to it. But the more you turn up the drive, the more artificial it sounds. I hate to use that word. It's very non-descriptive, but it doesn't sound, like tube distortion. It doesn't even really sound all that much like solid state clipping diode distortion. I'm not quite sure what it is, to tell you the truth. But the overall character just, I don't know, it ain't my thing. Now, I wanted to go through all of that to exemplify the point that I started this video with. I think you should view this as a mixing tool, less so than an amplifier replacement like you can use as pretty much all of other Neural DSP stuff. Because I'm not even a real bass guitarist, I just record bass. But when I plug into like the Dark Glass plugin or one of the bass amps on a Fractal Audio device, I kind of want to just screw around with bass because it sounds awesome. With this, not so much. So I can imagine if you're like a really passionate bass player, this is really not going to make you inspired to write much. This is really a tool to get your instrument to sit well with other instruments. So with that, keep that in mind as you hear some of these other tone demos. There's ones that I really like in this batch. There's others that I have no interest in revisiting ever again. But with that, here's some of the tones that you can get out of Parallax. So I guess it's that time again. Do I recommend Parallax? I think it's really going to come down to who you are and how you would use this, because when we're talking about high quality plugins like this, and make no mistake, this is a super high quality plugin as usual from Neural. The workflow, the presentation, everything is awesome. But on one end, you kind of have these production tools that they may sound nice and, you know, really work well together once you put them in a finished product, but maybe they're not necessarily the most inspiring things to play through. I would group a lot of the amp sims that's come out the past couple of years in that category. If Neural is kind of on the top when it comes to the nameless and the NTS. And then on the other hand, you've got stuff that not only sounds like the real deal, plays like the real deal, feels like the real deal, but works well in a mix as well. And that's the golden spot. I mean, if I'm going to be tracking through something, or if I just want to write or whatever, I want everything. You know, I want it to work in every scenario, and I want it to replace my rig. And this doesn't really do that. It's not to say you can't get a good bass sound out of it, and for especially some of those cleaner stuff, I really like it. But this doesn't capture the same feel, doesn't capture the same sound as a real bass amp, or even, you know, some of these boxes that try to replace them, whether it be Darkglass, Sans Amp, Mesa's got their own DI stuff, MXR's got their own DI stuff. I kind of prefer that sound, to be honest. I especially prefer the driven sounds of this, and even though you're adding distortion to basically the entire signal chain here, I still like this blend versus unblended distorted signal sound better than I do this split signal thing. It's more natural. Maybe it's not as clean or as sanitized, but that's just the sound I'm after. And so from a playability standpoint, as well as others, I really feel this doesn't hold up to the Darkglass plugin, because I use that to track basically every project. And after this, it doesn't look like that's going to change much. And from another point of view, at $100, this isn't necessarily a bad value whatsoever, but the $100 to $135-ish that you paid for the other plugins seemed like such an amazing deal. Even though it is software, you know, a lot of this stuff was modeling amplifiers that would cost 30 times as much, especially with the Plenty plugin, since it has, you know, like three amplifiers and all this gear, then it still came out to be a super good value. The Darkglass stuff, still a great value. And this, it's like, do I want to pay $100 to do the same thing that I can already do now, just sounding a bit more high quality? I don't know. It's going to come down to your use case. So I guess what I would say definitively is some people are throwing around phrases like, "Oh, this is the only bass plugin you'll need. This is going to kill all other options." No, it ain't. It's a good option to have, I think. And I think the biggest thing that really kills this premise for me is, aside from a couple pedals that have come out recently, relatively recently at least, you can't do this live. Darkglass does have a pedal called X7 that does this split frequency thing. And frankly, I would have liked to seen that modeled more than their own standalone versions, because I love what Darkglass does. But, you know, besides the Sans Amp sound and some other DI pedals, this didn't really exist, and therefore doesn't have the same ingrained sound that I like out of so many other platforms. So for that alone, I just prefer to have the traditional bass setup, especially if I want to put it to other, you know, real tube heads, that kind of thing. So for a final conclusion, this is a very high quality plugin. There are some really nice sounds to be had. And if you're a producer who's mainly worried about getting a workable bass sound to meld with a mix, then this is a good option. And for $100, I mean, what else do you have that can do all this in one plugin insert? It definitely saves time over doing a bunch of split signal chains. But if you're starting out right now and, you know, you've got bigger fish to fry, then your $100 are better spent elsewhere. I doubt this is going to be anybody's tone bottleneck. You're probably better off spending that money on better drum samples or better amps, you know, plugins for the guitar stuff, or upgrading your audio workstation program, getting a better interface. Anything is probably going to, you know, have a bigger impact on your overall sound than this will. And then if you're an actual bass musician, that's your instrument, I seriously doubt this tone is going to work for you in terms of being inspiring to play through. Some of them, sure. And especially for the metal guys, I think you're going to prefer kind of the traditional driven bass amp head sound. But I'm glad to see them branching off into different paths. I look forward to what future releases they may have, especially if it's more utility based like this. You can't model everything when it comes to real gear, and even if they do, they'll be running into stiff competition. So yeah, bring on more stuff. Certainly a good plugin. Just this one, it ain't for me. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time. Bye.